Shalom to everyone. My name is Menachem Leibtag. I'd like to share with you a short shiur on the biblical meaning of light in light of the holiday of Chanuka coming up, and titled From the First Day of Creation until the 8th day of Chanuka. That's the title. Now we'll get to the topic. The main topic of today's shiur is to try to understand not just the Torah reading for Chanuka, but where we should begin the Torah reading and where we should end it, because there's actually an argument or two different customs of where to begin the Torah reading on Chanuka. Should we begin with the beginning of chapter 7, when the princes bring their special korbanot on the day when the Mishkan is dedicated? Or do we begin with Birkat Kohanim in the previous section at the end of chapter 6, after the laws of Nazir? Before we begin, just a quick note about why this topic is in Sefer Bamidbar. You would expect that the dedication of the Mishkan and the special ceremony would be in Sefer Vayikra, because in Parshat Shmini and chapter 9 in Sefer Vayikra, we already have the special sacrifices that the Kohen Gadol brought on the 8th day. And on that very day, on the 8th day, in Sefer Vayikra, we're already told that Aaron lifted up his hands and blessed the people. So the natural place both for Birkat Kohanim and also for the dedication sacrifices of the Mishkan would be in Sefer Vayikra. For some reason, they recorded instead in Sefer Bamidbar. Well, when you look at Sefer Bamidbar, which begins with the 12 tribal leaders conducting a census of their armies, we already find a topic not only of leadership in Sefer Bamidbar, but 12 tribal leaders come up quite often. When we send the spies, there's 12 tribal leaders. Later, we have the tribal leaders who are going to lead them into Israel in Parshat Maseh. We're also going to have the census in Parshat Pinchas by tribes. Therefore, finding the 12 tribal leaders bringing sacrifices could also fit into Sefer Bamidbar, especially because one of their offerings is not only sacrifices, but also wagons to help carry the Mishkan. And because moving the Mishkan from Har Sinai and traveling with it through the desert to the land of Israel is another big topic in Sefer Bamidbar, it's understandable why chapter 7 is placed in Sefer Bamidbar and not in Sefer Vayikra. But the parsha that precedes it, Birkat Kohanim, and Aaron lighting the menorah, and the parsha that follows it in chapter 8, Parshat Balotcha, the commandment for Aaron to light the menorah, those surely should belong in Vayikra. And the question is, why are they put here in Sefer Bamidbar? What I'd like to do in the beginning of this year is first take a quick look at what we read. Again, we could begin with the end of chapter 6, Birkat Kohanim, but everyone begins with Vayi b'yom chalo Moshe lakim et hamishkan, and then we go day by day. Each of the princes had a special day, which is very fitting for Chanukah because we need a Torah reading for each day of Chanukah. Day 1, Yom HaRishon, day 2, Yom Sheni. We also have the word Chanukah, because in Pasuk Zayin, but in Pasuk Yud, we're told by Yikrivu Hansim et Chanukat HaMizbeach. The name of these special sacrifices are called the dedication of the Mizbeach. And at the end of the unit, we're told in the summary, in Pasuk Pei Dalet, Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach. So that's reason enough to read this on Chanukah. And finally, at the end of chapter 7, going into chapter 8, we have the special mitzvah for Aaron to light the menorah, Parshat Balotcha. I'd like to explain in the shiur a reason why it might make more sense to begin with Birkat Kohanim, and also why Birkat Kohanim precedes this section and why it's placed in Sefer Bamidbar. Let's take a look at Birkat Kohanim itself. What are we told? God tells Moshe, saying, Taber al Aaron v'banav lemor, speak to Aaron and his son, saying, Kol tevarchu et bnei Yisrael. This is how you should bless the children of Israel. Say them every day. I'm going to follow the Rashbam's explanation. Yivrachacha Hashem v'yishmerecha. Rashbam explains it's not the Kohanim blessing the people, but rather the Kohanim praying that God should bless his people and keep them, and that God should shine the light of his face upon them. We'll see later what that might mean. What does it mean for God to shine the light of his face? What is this light of God's face? And be kind to you. And also, Yisa Hashem panav elecha. You should find favor in God's eyes. V'yasem lecha shalom, and he should bless you and put peace upon you. That's the tripart blessing that the priests themselves recite every day. And then the Torah tells us in summary, V'samu et shmiya b'nei Israel, by doing so, the Kohanim will put the name or the reputation of God on the Jewish people. V'ani avarchem, I will bless them. Following the Rashbam, this is a prayer that God should bless the people. So the Kohanim every day in the temple make a prayer or recite this prayer that God should bless his people. What's the connection between that and the job of the Kohanim? To give a suggestion of the special connection between them, let's take a look at the Sim Shalom prayer, which we add in the Siddur after Birkat Kohanim. I'm sure you remember in Shacharit in the morning, in Chazar Tashatz, in the repetition of the Shmoneh Esrei, right before Sim Shalom, we have Birkat Kohanim. And it's quite easy to see that Birkat Kohanim is simply a prayer that Sim Shalom is a prayer that God should fulfill the blessing of Birkat Kohanim. To see why, we'll do a little annotation here and simply look at the obvious connections. What are we told? Kol Tavarchu B'nai Israel. Remember the three-part blessing, and finally the last line was V'yasem Lecha Shalom. Sim Shalom is taking the last line of the blessing and saying this blessing that God should put peace upon us. We're praying that God should indeed put peace upon us. Why the word Tovah we'll see very soon. Uvracha. Bracha, you can't miss the connection to bracha over and over again. And finally, God will bless you. So those are also obvious. And then we say Barchenu Avinu. And then B'tovia B'nechel Barchenu. The red is quite obvious. I can even erase it. Okay. Now, Chen matches V'chuneka. So that's an easy match. And Chen goes with Chesed and Rachamim. That for sure makes sense. How about Aleinu V'Kol Yisrael Lamecha? Kol Tavarchu Et B'nei Yisrael. And therefore that also matches. And matches also with V'Samach Shmiya B'nei Yisrael. So therefore we're asking God to put peace and fulfill the blessing V'Brit Kohanim on all the Jewish people. I want to focus in our shir though on the Or Panim. Again, the blessing was Ya'er Shem Panav. And therefore, the blessing in Sim Shalom is that God should put not only peace upon us, but also bless us, B'or Panecha. But Sim Shalom gives a beautiful explanation. What does it mean, the light of God's face? Ki B'or Panecha, Natata lanu Hashem Elokeinu Torat Chaim B'Avat Chesed. What we see here is that according to Sim Shalom, the light of God's face is simply the Torah. Not just the Torah Chaim, the Torah that guides our life, which leads to Avat Chesed, loving, doing kindness, and doing tzedakah, and having mercy on others, and living in peace with one another. This idea that the Torah is basically the light of God's face can also explain why we have the word Tov so often in Birkat Kohanim. What's Sim Shalom Tovah? And also V'Tovia B'Necha. The answer goes back to the first day of creation. Remember, in the first day of creation, the very first thing that God created was light. Let's take a quick look. God looked at that light, and it was good. So God's light, the light that God made, which is the Or Panim of Hashem, is something that's good. But now we need to see, why do Chazal understand that this light is the Torah? Because according to our blessing here, the Or Panim of God is none other than His Torah. What's the logic behind calling the Torah the light of God's face, and how does it relate to the first day of creation? Well, the answer is rather simple. When we take a look at the story of creation in Sefer Bereshit, I'm sure you're all familiar that the 6 days of creation, there's a beautiful parallel between day 1 and day 4 and day 2 and day 5 and day 3 and day 6. A topic of a separate shiur. We're only going to focus on the parallel between day 1 and day 4. Remember, God makes Or, and on day 4, He makes the sun and the moon to give us light in day and night. On day 2, God made the Rakia that divided between the heaven and the sea. On day 5, He made the fish in the sea and the birds in the heavens. On day 3, on the first act of creation, on day 3, He makes land On day 6, he makes land animals. And then on the second part of day 3, he makes vegetation, shrubs and fruit, and then he makes man in God's image and gives a diet relating to both vegetables and fruits. That's a topic for a class on Perek Aleph itself. I'd only like to focus on the big question, which all the commentators ask right away. What does it mean that God made light on day 1 if we don't have the sun and the moon and the stars until day 4? At the end of day 1, God says, Vayer vayboker yom echad, there was one day, and God calls the light day, and the darkness he calls night. But there's no sun and moon, which gives us day and night, until day 4. So the Gemara asks this question. The main source is in the Sechet Chagiga, Daf Yud Bet. V'or b'yom rishon ivri, was light created on the first day? V'achti v'ayitein otam elim b'rakei hashamayim. That's from day 4. What's it mean, light on the first day? The sun and the moon is not till the 4th day. V'achti v'ayeri boker yom revi'i. So how can the Torah say that light was created on day 1 if the sun and the moon that give us light, especially the sun, it's what gives us light, is created only on day 4? So the Gemara answers, Kid Rabbi Lazar, or Shabar Kadosh Baruch Hu b'yom Rishon, the light that God created on the first day, Adam tzofeh ba misof haolam ad sofo. It's a light that you can see from the beginning to the end. Kivan shenistakel Kadosh Baruch Hu b'dor Mabul, God saw that the generation of the flood was coming, and the generation of the dispersion of Dor HaFlaga. It saw that their actions were bad and evil. Amad v'gonzo mehem. God didn't want that light of creation, that tremendous light that gives the man the ability to see so well. He didn't want to waste it on these generations of terrible behavior, and he was saving it for a later time. Therefore, he put it into Geniza. He put it into safe storage. Shenemar v'manam yoshem oram. He doesn't let these evil people see his light. Ulemi gonzo. Who did God save it for? L'tzadikim latid lavo, for the righteous people in the future. Some people understand that this is talking about olam haba, the world to come. I'd like to suggest that Chazal were referring not to the world to come, but rather to Matan Torah. Tzadikim latid lavo, to receive the Torah in the future. Shenemar bayar Elohim et ha'or ki tov. Like we said before, God saw the light, it was good, and this tov is the Torah. Ve'in tov ela tzadik shneimar imru tzadik ki tov. A tzadik is someone who keeps the Torah. And therefore, at least according to the Sim Shalom, we're asking God, Sim Shalom tova uvracha, and then Kiv yor panecha natata lanu Hashem Elokeinu, v'tov yeh beinecha. If Sim Shalom is correct, that the Or Panim is actually the Torah, and God sees that light and it's good, that can explain why Tova is such a key word in the Sim Shalom, and again, the connection between Birkat Kohanim and teaching the Torah. But there's a much simpler answer of the connection between Birkat Kohanim and teaching Torah. The reason is simple, because the main blessing of Shevet Levi, in Source D, the blessing, what's the blessing of the tribe of Levi? Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov v'toratcha liYisrael. Moshe Rabbeinu, in V'zot HaBracha, gives each tribe their blessing, what they're supposed to be doing once we conquer the land. And the job of the tribe of Levi will be to teach the Torah, God's laws, as instruction to the people of Israel. To be God's people forever, we need to dedicate one of the 12 tribes to teaching Torah. The tribe of Levi, their leaders are the Kohanim. In fact, all through Sefer Devarim, the Kohanim and Levim pretty much have the same name. HaKohanim, HaLevim are always mentioned together. And even though the Kohanim and Levim work in the temple, only 1 out of 24 weeks is their service in the temple. The rest of the time, they're scattered among the different tribes, and their job is to be the teachers, the educators, the judges. They're going to make sure that the Torah is kept, enforced, executed properly, and without them, we wouldn't be the Jewish people. Therefore, the main job of the Kohanim is to teach Torah. And I'd like to share with you a reason why lighting the menorah, this idea of God's light, is symbolic of this job of teaching Torah. If light is the ability to see or understand God, or our purpose of creation, the Torah enables us to be able to see God. And then the responsibility of Shevet Levi will be to teach the Torah. Now, to understand the idea of the blessing, we have to go to another source in Chumash for the concept of blessing. That's in Parshat Nitzavim, or in Parshat Kitavo, I'm sorry, in chapter 28 in Devarim in the Tochacha. If you read that carefully, it's quite clear that the reason for blessing is not the Kohanim making this special incantation or saying these special words. The Kohanim blessing the people does not bring blessing to the Jewish people. According to Sefer Devarim, and not only in every Tochacha, all through the Torah, there's another reason for blessing, and that's if we keep God's laws. It's so obvious, we'll just read this section because the word Baruch, the word for blessing, is replete in this section. What are we told in Parshat, in chapter 28, in the Tochacha, in Parshat Kitavo? Should you follow God's laws, to keep all of his commandments, God will put you in a leadership position above the nations. All these blessings will come and they'll keep up with you. Again, on what condition? Should you obey God's words? Baruch atah ba'ir, baruch atah b'sadeh, baruch brit necha. You see the word baruch, baruch atah l'cha mishartecha, baruch atah b'voecha, baruch atah b'tzeitecha. This is the most, this is a place in Chumash where we find the word baruch more than anywhere else. Your enemies will fall before you. And finally, Yitzav Hashem itcha et habracha. This blessing will come in all your businesses, b'chol mishlach yadecha, in all of your agricultural produce as well. And God will bless the land that he's giving you. Should that happen, Yikimcha Hashem lo la'am kadosh, that will make you a nation separated in the service of God, as he swore to you at Har Sinai. Ki tishmor mitzvat Hashem alecha v'lachta b'derchav. Should you follow in the ways of God? Should you walk in his ways? L'lechet b'darchei Hashem. And keep his instructions properly. That will make you this Am Kadosh, this nation separated to serve him. And then finally, all the nations of the land will see that God's name, his reputation, is with you, is associated with you, and they'll be not in fear of you out of fear, but rather out of awe, inspiration, to inspire you. Notice that should we keep God's laws, and in light of our keeping God's laws, God will bless us, the fact that we keep God's laws, and we talk about God, and God blesses us with goodness when we keep his laws, that will promote God's reputation, and God's reputation will be associated with us. Remember the last line of Birkat Kohanim? V'samu et shmi b'nei Yisrael v'ani avarchem. The Kohanim put God's name on the Jewish people, and then so that God can bless them. How do the Kohanim put God's name on the people? It's simple, by teaching them Torah. The logic is straightforward. Basically, according to Chumash, what brings blessing is not magic incantations and saying magic spells. Rather, keeping the Torah and acting in a way that sanctifies God, by keeping God's laws, that brings blessing in our agriculture, in our lives. Chumash is replete with that idea. Should we not keep his laws properly, God will punish us harshly, almost out of proportion. He threatens us in the Tochachot. Should we keep his laws, he'll bless us. If we are, as a nation, gathered together, we talk about God, we pray to God, and the Kohanim bless us and teach us Torah, and God reciprocates by blessing us, that sanctifies God's name. That brings God's reputation, and other nations can learn from us. That's how we become a light to other nations. Therefore, this idea of putting God's name on the people, which is the last line of Birkat Kohanim, it's not recited, that's Chumash's summary of what the Kohanim do by reciting this tripart blessing. Here we see from Parshat Kitavo that when it says B'shamu et shmiya b'nei Yisrael, the way the Kohanim put God's name on the people is by teaching them Torah so that God will bless them. That fits nicely with the Rashbam's explanation that God should bless you, and Birkat Kohanim is not the Kohanim blessing the people, but rather the Kohanim praying that God should bless them. And that blessing is transformative, because if the Kohanim really believe that blessing comes by the people keeping the mitzvot, and it's their job to teach the Torah, therefore blessing the people every day with this tripart blessing is a reminder both to the priests, it's their job and the job of Shevet Levi to teach the Torah, And it's a reminder to the Jewish people receiving the bracha that the way they receive blessing from God is by keeping the laws that the Kohanim teach them. Just like Birkat Kohanim, then, as a daily blessing or daily prayer that's recited in the temple, and then afterwards now the rabbis instituted into the Shmoneh Esrei, into our daily prayers, which replaces the temple service, I'd like to suggest that lighting the menorah could serve a very similar purpose. Everything in the Mishkan is very symbolic, but of all the vessels in the Beit HaMikdash, the menorah, more than any other vessel, is associated with the Kohanim. The Kohanim do all the service in the temple. They do all the avodah, but we'll see how the menorah has a special connection to the Kohanim, and for sure a special connection to Chanuka. That's only because we light a Chanukiah, which looks like a menorah, but the entire story of the Hanukkah miracle was by the Hashmonaim, who were Kohanim. They themselves were priests who took also political leadership. And you can see already a connection between Parshat HaNesi'im, the 12 leaders are political leaders, and the Kohanim are the religious leaders, but not just religious leaders, they're also the teachers of the Torah, and hence they have an important leadership position, just like the tribal princes. But lighting the menorah, we're going to see, will take on special meaning because the menorah gives light. I'd like to show you, by taking a quick look at the structure of the second half of Sefer Shemot in the laws of the Mishkan, there's a special association between the menorah and the Kohanim. I'm sure you remember in Parshat Truma Tetzaveh, chapters 25 to 31, which are the laws of the Mishkan that follow Matan Torah in Parshat Yitro Mishpatim. There are two very distinct units. What's one called the Shekhinah unit, from chapter 25 through chapter 29. And it's very organized except for one glitch, with the Shemen Zayit, the beginning of Parshat Tetzaveh, which we'll see soon. After the Shekhinah unit, there's what we call the leftovers, things that should have been in the main unit. For some reason, they were left outside the Shekhinah unit. To explain what I mean, let's simply take a look at the outline that reviews everything from chapters 25 to 31. Why are we calling it a Shekhinah unit? Because the beginning of chapter 25, after introducing the need to donate materials, the Yichud Truma, the last line is V'asru li mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. God commands us, make a temple, and I will dwell among you. That's the introduction. Then we're told to make the Aron and the Kaporet. That's the Holy of Holies. And the Aron, which is going to house the Luchot HaBrit. And the Kaporet is a special cover with the Kruvim. That will be the first commandment, because that's at the heart of the Mishkan. And that's going to house the Luchot, which are the symbol of Matan Torah, the reminder of the covenant we made. And in the Aron will also be a copy of the Torah itself, the Kaporet guarding it with the Kruvim on top. We begin with those vessels. After that, we have the vessels in the Kodesh, also in the inner sanctuary, but the Shulchan and the Menorah. But notice that the Mizbach Torah here is missing. The Shulchan, where we have the table for the showbread, which is changed only once a week, and the Menorah, which is lit every day. So if we're looking what avodah, what service is done by the Kohanim on a daily basis, it's only the Menorah, because there's no avodah done in the Kodesh Kodashim except in Yom Kippur. In the Kodesh, every day we light the Menorah, the Shulchan only once a week with the showbread. Then we have the tent that covers the Kodesh. There's the Shulchan, Menorah, and the Aron are covered by the Oil Moed. That's relatively technical. Then we have the outside courtyard, where we have the Mizbach Olah, the outside altar, where we bring the daily sacrifices, and the Chatzer, the courtyard around it. The logic is from inside out. It's perfectly organized. Out of nowhere, after the Chatzer, at the end of chapter 27, we have the oil for the menorah, which surely belonged earlier with the oil for the menorah should have been earlier with the menorah. It says you're supposed to light the menorah, put the oil for the menorah together with the menorah. It doesn't belong after the Chatzer. For some reason, it's these laws of taking the Shemen Zayit, Katit Lamor, remember the beginning of Parshat Tetzaveh, that God commands Moshe to tell Bnei Yisrael to bring olive oil, pure olive oil, to the Kohanim, to light the menorah. For some reason, that's a bit out of place. After the laws of the Chatzer, we have the Big Day Kuna, chapter 28. or the different clothing, special clothing for the Kohanim, followed by the 7-day inaugural ceremony where we going to get the Kohanim ready. Therefore, the big day Kohana for sure go together with the 7-day inaugural ceremony, followed by the Olat Tamid that's brought every day, reminding us of that original inaugural ceremony, and then the Mishkan becomes functional. And when that's over, we have the Samri Psukim, which close up the Shechina unit. V'shachanti b'toch b'nei Yisrael v'yiti lev Elohim v'yadu k'nei Hashem asher tzeti otam me'eretz Mitzrayim l'shachni b'tocham. This unit ends with, by building this Mishkan, I would dwell among the people, and then this Mishkan will remind them, it will be a symbol that I took them out of Egypt for a purpose, not just for freedom, but to meet my people, to dwell among them so they can represent me among the nations. That's why we have this so-called Shechina unit, and we can take a quick look at it again, making it smaller, It begins with Vasudi Mikdash V'Shachanti and ends with V'Shachanti. And all this together, we call the Shechina unit, nice and organized, with one little glitch we called the oil for the menorah. Instead of being with the menorah, it's juxtaposed to the Kohanim, which already indicates there's a special connection between the menorah and the big day Kohana. And that's going to be our topic for Chanuka, that the Kohanim who are serving the Mikdash, they have a special association with the menorah and lighting the menorah, because that'll be symbolic of their job of teaching Torah. And teaching Torah enables us to see God's face or God's light, because the Torah enables us to perceive God and build a connection with Him. And when you light a menorah, when you take oil, and that oil turns into light, and the light enables you to see, just like in the physical world, light enables you to see your surroundings. In the spiritual world, light, the Torah, enables you to see and understand God. Now, when this section is over, we have what we call the leftovers. Without going all the details of that shiur, what is after the Shechina unit? We have the laws in chapter 30, the Mizbach Toret, the incense altar, then the half shekel to like money, which is also kapara. Almost all these relate to kapara. In other words, once the Shekhinah is there, we need protection from God's presence. And the kior is protection that you have to wash your hands in order to work on the Mizbeach. You have to bring a machzit shekel to protect yourself, especially when Am Yisrael goes to battle. Then we have Shemen HaMishcha for anointing all the kelim, and then making the Torah itself, which goes on the Mizbach Torah. And then we have appointed the builder B'Tzalel, and then the laws of Shabbat. So the main leftover of all these, the only kli that for sure belongs above is the Mizbach Torah. Because, and we see later in Parshat Vayikra Pekudei, that's exactly where we find it. What I want to show you is that the Mizbach Torah belongs up here in the oil moed next to the menorah. But for some reason it was left out. It's left out because the Mizbach Torah is not your classic service that we do. The Torah, just like on Yom Kippur, in order for the Kohen Gadol to enter the Holy of Holies, he can't enter without protection. Therefore, in order to enter, he has to bring Torah. In a similar manner, every day, in order for the Kohen, the regular Kohen, to light the menorah, to enter the Kodesh, he has to bring Torah. Torah is sort of an entry card. It enables entry into an area which should be off limits because God's presence is there. If man is only human and not perfect, in theory, he should not be able to enter an area where God is dwelling. God allows man, despite his imperfections, he dwells with us, even though we're tamei, to show God that we're getting something we might not deserve. We bring Torah to enable entry. What's going to prove this point? Let's take a look over here at the special law of the Mizbach Torah, how it's presented in Perek Lamed. Okay, what are we told after the details of the Mizbach Torah? V'ktira alav aron Torah samim baboker. Every day we bring Torah on the Mizbach Torah, on the incense altar. When? When Aaron comes in to light the menorah, or sorry, not to light to clean the menorah and get it ready in the morning, in order to enter, he brings Torah so that he can get the menorah ready. And in the evening, when he comes to light the menorah, ubalot Aaron et hanerot ben arba'im maktirana, Torah tamid lifnei Hashem l'dorotechem. What this seems to be saying is, the goal of lighting the Torah is enabling the entry to enter to light the menorah. The main avodah, the main service the Kohen does every day is lighting the menorah. That's symbolic of his job. In order to enter, he symbolically shows that we need protection, and he brings the Torah. The Torah is necessary because of the Shekhinah. After we have the Shekhinah unit, then we have the Torah to protect us from the Shekhinah. But the main avodah the Kohen is doing every day is lighting the menorah, not bringing the Torah. If we didn't have to light the menorah, we would need to go enter, and then we would need to bring the Torah. The Torah enables entry. So here again, we're highlighting that the main avodah of the Kohen on a daily basis is lighting the menorah. I'm talking about in the Kodesh. The main avodah in the Chatzer will be the Korban Tamid. Now, with this, we can conclude and maybe understand a little better what's happening in our Torah reading for Chanukah, and why Birkat Kohanim at the beginning and lighting the menorah at the end make beautiful bookends for chapter 7 with the 12 tribal leaders. Let's summarize briefly what we've seen so far. We saw on the first day of creation, God makes light, and we supported the Midrashic interpretation that that light is something symbolic of the ability to see God, because light in the physical world that we're used to comes from the sun, which is on day 4. There's a concept of light, the ability to see or to understand something, and God gave us a creation that enables us to see his existence through perceiving his creation through nature. That's in the physical world. But in a similar way, in the spiritual world, our ability to perceive God and our purpose in life is through the Torah. And the Torah is a type of light, kiner mitzvah v'torah or. Torah is a type of light that enables us to understand our connection to God and how we live our lives. We were trying to understand why in Sefer Bamidbar is the story of the Nisim bringing their sacrifices and their dedication presents to the Mishkan. Why is it flanked in the beginning by Birkat Kohanim, by the priestly blessings, and afterwards by lighting the menorah? If we look at the theme of leadership in Sefer Bamidbar, the future leaders of the Jewish people are the tribal princes. They're going to be running the country. They're the governors of each tribe. They're the political leaders. But leadership of the Jewish people is not only marked by their political leadership, also the educational leadership and the religious leadership is also no less important. And that's what Chazal say in the beginning of Parshat Balotcha, that Aaron felt bad that every day one of the tribal princes was giving a special korban. What was he doing? So of course there's the question, he was working every day in the temple, but rather, what political position did he have? And God says, your job of lighting the menorah, which represents Jewish education and teaching the Torah, is no less important than who's going to be the prime minister, who's going to be the secretary of state, or the defense minister, whatever cabinet positions Israel might have. With this in mind, I'd like to go back to our title, from day 1 of creation, which we talked about now, to the 8th day of Chanukah, or the 8th day in general. Remember, the 8th day in Chumash is a day that the Mishkan becomes functional after the 7 days of Miluim. Let's share a screen again. And I'd like to show you that the day of Hakamat HaMishkan, which was the beginning of chapter 7, Mishkan, is exactly, based on Sefer Shemot chapter 40, the first day of Nisan. Remember, in Shemot chapter 40, and on that day, bring Aaron and his sons and wash them, put the special clothing on them, anoint them, and that begins their official service on the first day of the dedication of the Mishkan. And sure enough, on the first day of the month of Nisan, Hukama Mishkan, and everything began. Then, going back, on that very same day, on that very first day, the first of Nisan, the tribal leaders come and bring their offering. First their wagons, and afterwards their special sacrifices. If we go back to our Torah reading, we summarize all the sacrifices that they brought in Pasuk Pei Daled. And this is what we read again on the 8th day of Chanukah. We start from day 8 and don't stop with day 8. We continue all the way through day 12 and the summary and our lighting the menorah. But this is what we're told. Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach b'yom himashach. Recall that all these sacrifices were first brought on the first day. If we go back to the beginning of what we were reading, on the very first day, all the Nisim brought their sacrifices on the very first day together. They were planning on offering everything on the first day. They all brought the same thing, but they all brought it on the same day. What did God tell Moshe Rabbeinu in Pasuk Yud Aleph? Vayom Hashem Moshe, Nasi echad layom yakriv et korbanam dachanot mizbeach. Instead of bringing all these sacrifices on the same day, God says, because of this unity of all the tribal leaders, every tribal leader, every Nasi gets a special day. And therefore, from day 1 to day 12, they dedicate the Mishkan. At the end of the Parsha, Zot Chanukat HaMizbeach b'yom himashach. This is a summary of what was brought on the first day. And in parentheses, we have the 12 days. And now we're actually back at day 1. We're not at day 12 or 13. Parsha Balokta begins back on day 1, on the day of Chanukat HaMizbeach. And therefore, on the same day that the Mishkan was dedicated and became functional, and the Nisim brought these special sacrifices, at the end of the day, on that very first day, is going to be the first time that Aaron will light his menorah. Therefore, chapter 8 of Sefer Bamidbar is simply a continuation of what happened on that day, because the last avodah, the last service in the temple, is lighting the menorah. God tells Moshe to tell Aaron, because you're about to light the menorah for the first time, remember, when you light the menorah, make sure they're facing in the right direction, and make sure they enlighten the Mishkan in the proper way, just as I commanded you earlier. So this idea of lighting the menorah, if it's symbolic of the main job of the Kohanim to teach Torah, Kiner mitzvah v'Torah or, Torah is the light that enables us to see God and our purpose, the Chanukah of the Nisim is surrounded, enveloped, by lighting the menorah at the end and Birkat Kohanim in the beginning. If our explanation of Birkat Kohanim is correct, that it's not a blessing, rather it's a prayer that God blesses people. And it's said by the Kohanim every day for the Kohanim to remember it's their job as educators to teach Torah. And for the people to remember at the receiving end, it's their job to study that Torah and keep those laws. And that will bring blessing. And by Am Yisrael keeping God's laws and receiving blessing, that will make God's reputation great. That will make us a light to other nations. And the true blessing from God doesn't come by the recitation of special words, but rather by understanding their meaning and by studying Torah. And in a symbolic manner, every day, the Kohanim bless the people, that they should be blessed by God. That should remind them that the people must follow the Torah and the Kohanim must teach it properly. And if that happens, the goal of the Torah will be fulfilled. So in the story of Hanukkah that we're commemorating, we're going to read every day from this section, it's about leadership of the people. It's about the job of the Kohanim as leaders, not only as officiants in the temple, but also as educators with a very important job in the building of our nation. And the whole story of Hanukkah, where the Greeks were challenging our right to study Torah and to keep the Torah, and the revolt of the Hashmonaim, which rose against that, and they took initiative and rededicated the temple. That rededication of the temple was symbolized more than anything by the miracle of the menorah and lighting of the menorah. Even though they had to redo all the kelim, all the vessels of Beit HaMikdash, the focus of the holiday is specifically on the menorah because it represents the idea of studying Torah and keeping the Torah. It was exactly that decree by the Greeks that they forbade us from learning Torah. And now we fought to have the right to learn it again. That makes this Torah reading especially special during the holiday of Hanukkah. Finally, after the second temple was destroyed, the question remains, why continue celebrating Hanukkah? Therefore, the hope that one day we return to having a temple and returning to the proper service of God, keeping all of his laws in our land, The menorah now symbolizes not only the miracle that happened in the past, but the hope for a better future. And that just like the Hashmonaim were in a time of despair, but they had courage to overcome the problems, take initiative, and restart their nation in a proper manner, we hopefully can be inspired by them and continue to build our nation by keeping the Torah. And if the teachers of Torah must remember every day it's their job to teach and understand the Torah properly, and the job of the people to study and keep it and apply it properly, that should bring the true blessing to the Jewish people. And in light of that, unintended, everyone should have a happy Chanukah.